Bonjour, everyone. This is Tetsuo Sakomura from Morisawa. I hope you had a yummy lunch and rest a little bit, came back with a refreshing mind. And I also like to thank ATypI for this amazing conference. My talk is going to be about subordinate Latin type. And Japanese is written and structured using a combination of ideograms, Chinese characters, and phonograms, which is Kana. This is a unique writing system in the world, but there's more. In addition to kanji and kana, the Latin alphabet also plays an important role in the Japanese writing system. Subordinate Latin type is a specific Latin typeface which is designed to be used in Japanese Latin mixed typesetting situations. The history of subordinate Latin type has evolved side by side with Japanese text. At first, these Latin designs were subservient to the Japanese aesthetic. However, with recent globalization, the needs have shifted. Now the goal has become closer to harmonization between two scripts. In addition, multinational companies need type for more than one market, more than ever. With this in mind, I would like to introduce our recent project called A1 Gothic. Here's my special guest. I bet you're wondering why he's standing next to me. Cyrus worked with us, and he will tell about the project.
Okay. Thank you, Tetsuo. I've been working with Morisawa on and off for the last few years. And this has meant a lot of travel to Japan, which has been very enjoyable. It's a beautiful country. To my eyes, a very graphic place. There are letters and images everywhere, and wires, too. And beautiful colors, shades of gray with intense reds and yellows and a kind of unique turquoise. I'm tempted just to show my travel slides and sketches for the next 20 minutes, but I probably shouldn't. When people learn about my work with Morisawa, I get two questions, and that is, do you speak Japanese? And are you drawing Japanese typefaces? And the answer to both of those questions is no. Maybe someday, but for now, no. I'm working with Morisawa because of my experience as a Latin type designer. And this has led to my introduction to multi-script typography, down a path to some deeper insight into Latin typography, which, to be honest, as a topic I thought I was pretty familiar with. And as well, it's also intensified my interest in drawing and some of my own private theories about space and shape. So in 2015, I spent 3 weeks in Akashi to collaborate with Morisawa designers in adapting my Latin design, Allium, to work as the subordinate Latin for their Japanese design, A1 Gothic. As Tetsuo explained, a subordinate Latin is a Latin typeface designed to be used in mixed Japanese and Latin typesetting. These aren't bilingual documents. The dominant language is Japanese, and the reader is fluent in Japanese. And at some point, during all this correspondence and conversations, I got tired of typing out subordinate Latin. So as sort of a joke, I proposed the term Latingy. And surprisingly, it's catching on, at least at Morisawa, so we'll see what happens. Before I went to Akashi, I needed to draw a Latin typeface to go with Morisawa's Japanese typeface, A1 Gothic. So this is when I started developing the design that came to be known as Allium. These are a type of Allium. I recommend naming a typeface after a plant, because then you can walk around and find beautiful plants and think of your typeface instead of looking for typefaces all the time. It's a good change of pace, I think. But the thing was, when I started drawing this new typeface, I hadn't actually signed enough non-disclosure agreements to actually see A1 Gothic. Instead, they sent me a description of A1 Gothic and what they wanted me to draw. And looking back, this was actually a good way to start. Morisawa described to me a sans serif, something that was kind of soft and had a warm impression based on Western calligraphic conventions with its roots in 20th century era hot metal type. No one here will be surprised that I immediately thought of the early humanist sans serifs from Eric Gill and Edward Johnston and that kind of thing. And I especially thought about Johnston's sans serif for the metro in London, of course, because that's a beautiful design. And it seemed like that's what Morisawa was looking for, this kind of softness that I think that design has. The shapes in this design in Johnston kind of lack precision and refinement of some of the later sans serifs. But I think it's the close ratio of black and white shapes that gives it that kind of solidity that's very pleasing visually. My instinct was this is what Morisawa was looking for, and this is what I tried to develop when I was drawing this series. The lowercase g is clearly, an homage to Johnston. So I made a print of it in my studio in my garage because I liked the shapes so much. But that came later. First, I had to make sketches for Morisawa, still without seeing their Japanese design. And like all sketches, they were pretty clunky, and like a lot of my sketches, they were kind of squarish. And it was good enough start, though. At least it was close enough that we could get into a more productive discussion about what it should look like. And I finally got to see the Japanese design. As I said, though, in retrospect, it was very helpful not seeing the Japanese design at first. This let me visualize the Latin design based only on their description. In this sense, I was able to focus on the spirit of the design without getting caught up in the details. To my Latin eyes, Japanese has a much larger inventory of different kinds of details than I'm used to. For example, there are more different kinds of stroke endings in a typical than you find in a typical Latin sans serif. So if I had been looking for visual cues, I probably could have found just about any detail I wanted to justify what I wanted to draw. So obviously, there are many differences between the Latin writing system and the Japanese writing system. And I don't know enough about Japanese to really have anything very insightful to say about these differences. I can tell you, though, about my preconceptions. Going into this project, I thought adapting my Latin design into a subordinate Latin would mostly be a matter of altering the dimensions. With that in mind, I created a design space with two axes, one for weight and one for x height. With these two axes, I figured we could tune in the right weight and size relative to the kana and the kanji. And I was especially excited about the x height axis. My thinking was that Japanese doesn't have an uppercase and lowercase like in Latin. Therefore, it would be kind of handy and interesting to experiment with minimizing the size differences between the cases. But around this time, I was working on a gasket, sans serif design, which also contains a unicase and uncial alternates. So this is a close-up of the business card I made for myself. So it's a Latin without lowercase, perfect for harmonizing with kanji and kana. And part of me was wishing that we could revolutionize subordinate Latins with a treatment like this. But we didn't, which is probably good. But back in reality, we found that the weight and width axes were very helpful. I was surprised, though, by how many additional changes the Morisawa designers wanted to make. Changes not just to dimensions, but to the overall tempo of the letter spacing, as well as changes to the shapes of certain glyphs. In principle, I wasn't opposed to these changes once I got over my surprise. And I quickly realized there was a lot I didn't know about the relationship between Latin and Japanese. So I learned that I needed to keep an open mind about altering my original design. And I started thinking that adapting a Latin into a subordinate Latin, or Latingy, right, is a task beyond any type designer without a strong familiarity in both writing systems. It's not just a matter of harmonizing two different scripts. It's a matter of adapting one for the readers of the other. In fact, I think there are very few type designers who are fluent enough and experienced enough in both writing systems to do it themselves. My feeling is that most high-quality subordinate Latins will be the result of collaborations. I'm curious to hear what Mr. Taro Yamamoto has to say about this tomorrow. But in this spirit, the interesting thing about this process was this. On the one hand, I was working with very experienced type designers. On the other hand, the vast majority of their experience was with the Japanese writing system, not Latin. So thanks to this combination, we got into very different discussions about how Latin type works, different than the ones that I usually have with my students or with my colleagues. So the letters of the Latin alphabet evolved to be written in a horizontal line with a sense of direction going from left to right. One of the results of this evolution is that a line of text has a specific kind of momentum or flow that pulls the reader's eye across the page. In a typeface, the big parts of this flow are addressed by how the letters are shaped, in the sense, do they look like they belong together? And their spacing, do they fit together to form unified words? There's another layer too, though. It's the patterns formed by different kinds of interior white shapes of each letter. Part of this pattern has to do with the widths of the letters themselves. Part of it has to do with the hierarchy of size relationships among the white shapes. And part of it has to do with the syncopation of the different kinds of shapes. Whereas the relationship between side bearings can be handled pretty systematically, the relationship between the interior white shapes are more difficult to address. These shapes are more spread out. This makes the pattern weaker and harder to see. So it's subtle, but it's still there. And when it's handled well, the result contributes to a typeface's often ineffable sense of correctness. I'll borrow a word from Frank Blockland to describe it: cadence. Cadence usually refers to pitch, but it also refers to the rhythmic flow present in a sequence. And that's what I'm talking about here. And I like this word cadence because it also reminds me of the Spanish word cadena, for chain. And it makes me think of a line of text as a chain, pulling the eye of the reader across the page. Cadence is about the horizontal momentum in a line of text. And also, I had these sketches of chains that I really wanted to use in a lecture. But by altering the shapes in my typeface, its cadence was being changed. The spacing was still fine. The letters still looked like they belonged together, but the flow became weaker. The differences were subtle, but I could see them. So the struggle became, how do I explain this to my colleagues at Murasawa? I realized I didn't have a very effective vocabulary for this situation. Why was that, I wondered? Well, I don't get into this kind of subtle detail with my students. Basic drawing and spacing keeps us more than occupied. However, I haven't discussed this topic very often with colleagues either. I hope I'm not revealing a huge hole in my training by saying that. But I think we maybe all know what cadence is. Perhaps it doesn't come up very often because usually we're fluent in a language that employs the Latin alphabet. Years of reading and writing have imprinted a sense of cadence on our brains. This is a U.S. judge, a United States judge. This is how he defined obscenity. I know it when I see it. It's a very common phrase in the United States. And you use it when you're attempting to describe something that you can observe, but the subject lacks clearly defined parameters. So it fits in just right here. And this raises an important question that I know many people here have already been thinking about for a long time. How important is it to read and write in an alphabet you're designing type for? And I don't know. It's not a question with just one answer. So while the Murasawa designers were working on this very complicated problem, I was working on this children's book. Big, dumb drawings. This is where I'm really at home. The title of the book is Ari Inu Usagi. It's a hiragana primer for 5-year-olds. And this is my lettering. These are my drawings, and this is my lettering. Thanks to projects like this, I'm slowly learning Japanese in kind of a weird way. So to do this lettering, I studied writing manuals and did exercises to learn the correct stroke order and direction. And at the time, my young daughter was in kindergarten. She thought it was quite funny I was doing the same kinds of writing exercises as she and her classmates. So I did this lettering myself because I think it's important for there to be a strong visual connection between the drawings and the words. So I had a very specific reason for doing this in this project. And I'm told that this lettering reads well. And this is thanks to input from my colleagues at Murasawa. And I'm told that it looks good too. But let's be honest, this is very childish, cartoonish lettering. Its charm mostly comes from me not knowing what I'm doing. My attempts at more typographic forms were not so charming. These comments might not seem like much, but they are equivalent to pointing out mistakes like you drew the S upside down and you're not aligning things to the baseline right. Basic stuff, not the kind of subtlety I was struggling to discuss with the A1 Gothic designers. And honestly, I think they were also being kind of nice to me, and they held back. The good news is that when I made these cards, it was print on demand, so I didn't do so many of them. But as I said, I don't know what effect reading and writing have on type design. But surely they do have an effect. And you cannot just show up and expect your experience in one writing system to apply to another. So maybe the question to ask is how to use that to advantage. How to use that as an opportunity for collaboration of all sorts, as well as education. So all these things were on my mind while I was stumbling around Japan. One afternoon, I happened to go to an exhibit of the work of a very beloved children's book illustrator, Chihiro Iwasaki. Even though she's very widely known in Japan, I'll confess that I was not familiar with her work. It made a really big impression on me, though. Iwasaki's use of white space in her compositions is quite striking. Her imagery is sentimental, of course, but it is her use as space as emptiness or silence that really makes it work, in my opinion. When I saw this exhibit, I actually got a little teary. I missed my family, and there were all these children, and it was quite moving. Now, there's sometimes a practical reason for all this white space in her paintings. She had to leave room for text to be added later by a typesetter. Nevertheless, I believe her use of emptiness was a deep part of her approach to composition. And of course, not all the empty areas are literally white. And you can see her thinking about emptiness and silence in these personal sketches as well. These weren't for books. In this sense, there's a connection to traditional landscape imagery found in much of Japanese art, even though in other ways her style shows a European influence. So you can contrast Iwasaki's use of white space as emptiness to an artist like Matisse's use of white space. In his work, especially his cutouts, the white becomes active shapes that compete for dominance with the positive space. The white space is anything but empty. It's about the figure-ground relationship. In this case, it really is a figure, too. Or if you'd like an example closer to home, there's the work of Frutiger. And of course, we're always talking about white space in type design and typography. And it's tempting to make a generalization here about the differences between Eastern and Western art, and to attempt to connect that to type design. But I'm going to resist this temptation because, again, I don't really know. Instead, I try to use experiences like this to look inward and to question myself and my own knowledge. So as I said earlier, I don't really know enough about Japanese to have any meaningful insights about its differences with Latin. And thanks to this project, I realized that I probably don't know all that much about Latin either. So as I enter the third decade of my career, I'm quite grateful for this perspective. Thank you.